I've done a couple of episodes recently that I'm quite proud of. The last two movies that I reviewed are great examples of movies that excel within their own genre and do great justice to the stories that they set out to tell. I tried to give those last two videos a sincere and heartfelt atmosphere while still trying to attempt to make you all laugh. And seeing how it's November, which means it's just about the end of the semester, I'm a student and my brain is just about fried, I feel it's time to explore a little gem of a box office blunder known as UHF.
Hope you enjoy it!
Now, of course, UHF has fallen back out of obscurity in recent years since it came to DVD. But initially, it was almost completely washed over in theaters, making a laughable profit. Released in the summer of 1989, it was a modest film with a modest budget on the scale of something that would likely be produced for an internet-only release nowadays. Movies like this can occasionally grab the attention of the public and be really successful, especially when it's written by and starring the most famous pop culture comedian of all time. However, this movie was released in a summer that would turn out to be one of the least modest years in movie making ever. Now, for those of you who weren't around in the 1980s, don't remember, or simply don't pay attention to time, here's a little idea of what UHF was up against that year. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Star Trek V, Electric Hand Jive, Dead Poets Society, Ghostbusters 2, Batman, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, The Karate Kid Part 3, Lethal Weapon 2, Weekend at Bernie's, Parenthood, Nightmare on Elm Street 5, Halloween 5, Jason Takes Manhattan, The Abyss, The Little Mermaid, and Back to the Future 2. So yeah, what could have possibly stood in this movie's path to success? Really bad timing.
Hey! We screwed up!
Well, thankfully, the most faithful of Weird Al fans have the loyalty and the enthusiasm of Grateful Deadheads. They smell just as bad as Deadheads too, but unlike Deadheads, they rarely see the light of day, and they only dance when waiting in line at the bathroom after drinking a liter of Mountain Dew. But if you've ever been to a Weird Al show, you know that the crowds there tend to be pretty unique in their enthusiasm, and they seem to follow just about every song, video, and comedy sketch Mr. Yankovic has ever done. And according to interviews with Al himself, fans would often recite the lines of the movie when he'd show clips of it at his concerts even when the home video was still out of print. Now, if you're really determined to follow the storyline of this movie, here's the stone skinny of it. Al plays George Newman, a daydreaming screw-up who can't hold down a regular job. His gambling uncle wins a small TV station in a poker game and decides to give George a shot at being the station manager. Through George's off-the-wall programming ideas,
Lesbian Nazi hookers abducted by UFOs and forced into weight loss programs. All this week on Town Talk.
And some unexpected twists of happenstance, such as the station janitor becoming the biggest children's programming hit since being conceived of prior to the invention of Barney the Dinosaur, the station U62 ends up becoming a huge hit within the surrounding area. And just like so many Fish songs are written for the sole purpose of allowing the band to have something to base their 20-minute jams around, UHF's storyline is a reasonably adequate vessel in which to carry Weird Al's random ideas for parodies and sketches that have very little to do with the rest of the movie. And that's what I think makes it somewhat more appealing to the internet generation now compared to how well it went over at the time of its release. You almost feel as if you're flipping through stations every time the central story goes to commercial, except you have no control over when you change the channel and what you're changing the channel to. And since a lot of what you're changing the channel to seems to be commercials, it doesn't really make sense that you're watching the channels with commercials instead of what you were already watching. Except maybe that the commercials are more entertaining than the actual program itself. Now, of course, that's not really the case with this movie, or any other rational thinking person's thought process.
Like if you were traveling through outer space, I mean, like you're going real fast, like the speed of light, you know, and all of a sudden you start screaming, ah, ah! You think that your brain would blow up.
But UHF wasn't really intended to appeal to rationally minded people. So there was this whole plot thing that I mentioned. With the success of making Stanley Spadowski the new host of the morning children's program, George Newman is able to start flooding the airwaves with a string of strange and off-color shows to attract audiences from all demographics.
Gandhi 2.
And when the U62 channel becomes the #1 station in the city of California land, the owner of the local network affiliate becomes determined to kill the station's popularity. Coincidentally, George's uncle suddenly becomes a great deal in debt to his gambling bookie, forcing George's uncle to have to sell the station to the owner of Evil Channel 8 unless George can come up with $75,000 to buy the station. So they hold a telethon to sell shares of the station to the public to raise the money needed to keep the owner of Evil Channel 8 from turning the building into a parking lot. In the midst of this, Stanley is kidnapped by the Channel 8 thugs, which leaves George and the U62 crew with a lack of quality entertainment to support the telethon. Thankfully, the power of Stanley being reunited with his favorite mop gives him the retard strength to escape and defeat his captors. And because Evil Channel 8 guy gave a special penny to a panhandler earlier in the time code of the movie, this turns out to be the undoing of his attempt to kill UHF 62.
That thing was worth a fortune. When I cashed it in, I got enough money to buy a whole bunch of shares, plus I got me a real neat watch.
George pays off his uncle's bookie, and everyone explodes into 1980s victory.
We did it! The station's done!
Yeah, leave it up to Red Dawn to kill our 80s nostalgia victory. And that's pretty much the whole story.
I said it wasn't important.
How often do you get to recommend a movie to people where you get to say that the actual plot isn't really important to the rest of the movie? Other than porn. In a nutshell, this movie is a rare occurrence. It's what happens when someone gets the opportunity to get their friends and acquaintances together and just let their imaginations run wild.
I just thought... Supplies!
You might have noticed that I didn't mention anything about the side story involving Weird Al and his girlfriend. That's because George's girlfriend is played by Victoria Jackson, a once semi-talented comedic actress from Saturday Night Live who has now metamorphosized into a homophobic, fascist, anti-feminist that needs to be sucked into a giant blender. So what the heck else really needs to be said about this movie? If you've never seen it, then you're missing out on a history lesson about where a big chunk of our comedic culture was headed. I'm not exactly saying this flick is a trendsetter, but I certainly think movies like this, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and a few others are good examples of the impending realization that our pop culture was careening towards a heavy influence of dorkness. But not before it went through darkness, and then pure evil. And now pop culture seems to reside within the depths of Atrocity's dog. But thankfully there's hope out there too, especially on the internet, where dorks can be popular with a $50 webcam and a remedial knowledge of video editing. And it's silly movies like UHF that I really believe had a big influence over the dweebial influx over our TVs, movies, and music. So give UHF a try sometime if you're in need for a movie that really only requires you to have no real requirements about what it takes for you to enjoy a comedy. And if you're a regular viewer of my show, chances are those requirements are right up your alley. This is Topher from Movie Misperception saying you may not like it, but that doesn't mean that I won't not too.
You better watch out where you go. You better stop that laser game. You'll smell my mule.